Good morning.
Good morning.
For the last 4 weeks, we have been looking at the faith of God's family, the first members of God's family in the book of Genesis. And in week 1, we looked at the faith of Noah. In Noah, we learned that rest is not achieved when we complete our work. Rest is achieved when God completes his work. And sometimes that may come long after we have completed our work. In week 2, we looked at the faith of 2 of Noah's sons, Shem and Japheth. In Shem and Japheth, we learned that faith honors authority, even when we have seen their shame. Shem and Japheth teach us how to honor our parents, whose shame all of us have seen, their mistakes and their faults as children. But more importantly, Shem and Japheth teach us that as we learn how to honor our parents, we learn how to honor someone with even greater authority and even greater shame, and that is the Lord Jesus. In week 3, we looked at the faith of Abraham. In Abraham, we learned that faith waits, and waiting obtains promises. In the Christian life, that is the way that the promises of God are obtained. They are obtained by waiting, and there is no other way. And so when you find yourself waiting, maybe longer than you think you need to, keep on waiting, because the promise is coming. In week 4, last week, we looked at the faith of Abraham's nephew, Lot. And in Lot, we learned that faith understands that even when we have a faith like Lot's, weak, little, fickle, sometimes unreliable, it is still a faith that delivers. We saw last week that despite Lot's many mistakes, bad choices, sins, Lot experiences deliverance after deliverance in his life, particularly 3. We saw that Lot was delivered from idolatry. We saw that Lot was delivered from slavery, and we saw that Lot was delivered from destruction. In his deliverance from idolatry, we saw that although Lot was born into the offspring of promise, he was born into a family and generation that worshiped other gods. But Yahweh would deliver him from his idolatry, and he did that by appearing to Abraham and telling him to go to a land that will show him. And although Yahweh only appeared to Abraham and only spoke to Abraham, when Abraham went out to see that land, Lot went with him. And when Abraham went, he went by faith. And this means that when Lot went, he also went by faith. And his faith delivered him from idolatry. In his deliverance from slavery, we saw that when the land could not support the livestock of Abraham and the livestock of Lot, Lot separated from Abraham. And he moved far away from him to the land of Sodom. Why? Because he saw that it was well watered everywhere. But what he failed to see was that although it was well watered everywhere, it was also evil everywhere. And the evil of Sodom eventually led them to rebel against the kings of the land, the kings of Kedar-Laomer. But they lose, and Lot is captured as a slave. And even though Lot should have seen the evil of Sodom, and even though he probably should not have ever moved there, Yahweh would deliver him from his slavery. By God's providence of fugitive escapes, And he travels as far as to where Abraham is living in the mountains and tells him what happens to Lot. And by God's providence, with just 318 men, Abraham defeats 4 kings. And he saves Lot from his slavery, along with all of Lot's people and all of his possessions. In his deliverance from destruction, we saw that rather than recognizing that it would be safer to return with Abraham, to go out of the land of Sodom, Lot continues to live in Sodom. Continues to live there. During this time, Lot becomes a judge over the city, and he cries out to Yahweh over Sodom's wickedness. You would think that Yahweh would refuse to hear him, but he hears that the outcry against Sodom is great. Despite the fact that Lot is the one who chose to continue to live there, Yahweh hears his cries and sends 2 angels to destroy the city, but not before delivering Lot. And in the middle of his deliverance, 2 times Lot almost gets himself destroyed along with them. When the angels tell him to get out of the city, what does he do? He hesitates. So that they have to drag him out of the city just to get him out. And when the angels tell him to escape all the way to the mountains, he doesn't. He escapes to a nearby town. And yet, although that town was also destined for destruction, Yahweh would spare it because of Lot. Despite Lot's many sins, the faith that led him to go out with Abraham was the same faith that delivered him. We learned last week that ought to give us an enormous amount of comfort in our life. Because if we are honest with ourselves, our faith is less like Abraham's and more like Lot's. And that's okay, because your faith will deliver you too. Today, I want us to take a look at the faith of 2 other individuals in the family of God. And that is the faith of Hagar, Sarah's servant woman, Sarah's slave, and Hagar's son, Ishmael. Like Lot, these may not seem like these 2 people are even part of the family of God. Now, if you have read the book of Galatians recently, you may be wondering how it is even possible to say anything about Hagar's faith or Ishmael's faith or to learn anything from them. And we will talk about that when we get there. There is a lot more to Hagar and Ishmael than you might think. So bear with me and we will address it when we get there. Today, as we look at Hagar and Ishmael, I want us to learn this lesson of faith. Faith understands that when nobody else sees us, when nobody else hears us, God sees us and God hears us. That is the lesson of faith that I want us to learn from Hagar and Ishmael. And I want us to do that by looking at 2 passages. The first is Genesis chapter 16. And the second is Genesis chapter 21. Verses 8 through 26. Oh, sorry, 8 through 21. These 2 passages encompass the life of Hagar and Ishmael. In Genesis chapter 16, we will learn from Hagar that God sees us. And in Genesis chapter 21, we will learn from Ishmael that God hears us. Now, when I was preparing this, I realized that we won't be able to go through both passages today. We'll just be able to only go through the first. So this will be a two-part kind of lesson. This week, we'll look at Genesis chapter 16 and at Hagar. And next week, we will look at Genesis chapter 21 and at Ishmael. So first, let's look at Genesis chapter 16. Let's look at Hagar and learn from her that God sees us. Genesis chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And she had an Egyptian servant woman whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, Yahweh has shut my womb from bearing children. Please go into my servant woman. Perhaps I will obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife, Sarai, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant woman, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. Then she saw that she had conceived. So her mistress became contemptible in her sight. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the violence done to me be upon you. I gave my servant woman into your embrace, but she saw that she had conceived, so I became contemptible in her sight. May Yahweh judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant woman is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your sight." So Sarai afflicted her, and she fled from her presence. Now the angel of Yahweh found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, Sarai's servant woman, where have you come from? And where are you going?" And she said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." Then the angel of Yahweh said to her, "Return to your mistress and humble yourself under her hands." Moreover, the angel of Yahweh said to her, "I will greatly multiply your seed so that they will be too many to be counted." And the angel of Yahweh said to her further, "Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has heard your affliction. And he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will dwell in the face of all his brothers." Then she called the name of Yahweh who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." For she said, "Have I even remained alive here after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Now Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. So let's take a look at this passage. Let's take a look at Hagar's life, verse by verse. Let's start with verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian servant woman whose name was Hagar. So at this point in time, Abraham and Sarah have been sojourning in the land of Canaan for 10 years. 10 years. And 10 years earlier, Yahweh had appeared to Abraham and told them that he would have a seed. And yet, for 10 years, no seed has come. And we're reminded of this here in verse 1. All of this time, Sarah has been unable to bear a child, a single child. But she has a servant woman. And it is a servant woman who is an Egyptian. And twice in this passage, we're told, reminded, that she is an Egyptian. We're told that she's an Egyptian in verse 1. And then we're told again that she's an Egyptian in verse 3. So there's two possibilities here. Either you're told that she's an Egyptian because in between reading verse 1 and verse 3, you might forget. Okay. Or we're told twice that she's an Egyptian because it is significant that she is an Egyptian. She's not just any servant woman, she is an Egyptian servant woman. And so there are two things that we could glean from this. The first is the fact that we're told that she is an Egyptian tells us when she was acquired as a servant woman. She was probably acquired as a slave, as a servant woman, when Abraham and Sarah had sojourned in Egypt. Remember that when Abraham and Sarah were sojourning in Egypt, and Pharaoh took Sarah to be his wife, what did Pharaoh give to Abraham? He gave him male and female servants. And so that is probably where Hagar was acquired, all the way back from the land of Egypt. But there's another reason why we're told that she is Egyptian. Not to tell us her origins, but to tell us how we ought to feel now that we have read that she is an Egyptian. Why did Abraham go to Egypt in the first place? Anybody remember why? There was famine in the land. Abraham and Sarah sojourned to Egypt because there was famine in the land. In other words, when the land could not bear food, Abraham and Sarah turned to Egypt. And now in verse 1, when Sarah cannot bear a child, where will Abraham and Sarah turn? They will turn to Egypt. This time for a child in the form of an Egyptian slave woman. See that? And so why does Sarah want to do that? Right? This gives us, it makes us feel uneasy, right? That something bad is going to happen. And of course, you know, we read the whole passage. Something bad is going to happen. Verse 2. So Sarai said to Abram, now behold, Yahweh has shut my womb from bearing children. Please go into my servant woman. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. So Sarai offers a solution in the same way that Abraham offers a solution to the famine of the land in Egypt. Sarai offers a solution to her barrenness, to the famine of her womb in her Egyptian servant woman. And she reasons that maybe the child that God promised, maybe the seed that God promised will not actually come from me, but it will come from a different woman. What is Sarai asking to do here? She's asking for surrogacy. She's asking for Abraham to impregnate another woman and for that woman to give Sarai the child that she will conceive. Now, in some ways, this is not unreasonable for Sarah to reason this way. And the reason why I say this is because it really is true that up until this point in Abraham and Sarah's life, God has never said who the child would come from. He only ever said that Abraham would have a seed, but not through which woman. It's not till after this that God tells Abraham that it will become through Sarah. But at the same time, Sarah is being extremely unreasonable. Because all throughout redemptive history so far, it is very clear, very obvious that polygamy is sinful. We see that when Lamech had married many wives. And we also see that in the intermarriage of God's people with the descendants of Cain. In the same verse, we also hear a phrase that should also make us feel uneasy in verse 2. What does it say? When Sarah proposes to Abraham to go into Hagar in order that Sarah would obtain a child through her, what does it say about Abraham? It says, and Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Let me ask you, does that sound familiar to you? It does, right? It does. Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. This reminds us of someone else who listened to the voice of his wife. The only other person for which this phrase has been used in the book of Genesis, and that is Genesis chapter 3:17. Let me read it to you. Genesis chapter 3:17. Then to Adam, he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. Do you hear that? So what does this phrase do? What is it telling us? It's telling us that Abraham and Sarah are doing what? They are behaving like Adam and Eve behaved in the garden. Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden by taking forbidden fruit. And Abraham and Sarah are doing the same, except this time, who is the fruit? It's Hagar. She is the woman for whom they were not supposed to take. And in fact, in the following verse, we learn that that is exactly what Sarah does. Verse 3, and after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife, Sarai, does what? Took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant woman, and does what? Gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. That phrase should also be familiar to you, because it comes from Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Let me read that to you. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Then the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. So she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband. You see, the author of the passage, the writer, most likely Moses, he's using the same phrases to tell you that Abraham and Sarah are acting like Adam and Eve. They're fallen. They're fallen. And this tells us that although Sarah did not know who the child would come from, what she does and what Abraham does is a fall. It is sin. They take what they're not supposed to take, Hagar, to use her womb for fruit. Now it's worth reflecting for a moment that Hagar is a slave, a servant woman, and she's being forced into surrogacy. This is some nasty stuff. This is from your patriarchs, Abraham and Sarah. This is what they want to do to Hagar, to use her to make a child for Sarah. to use her body so that way Sarah could be elevated with a child. But things don't go as planned. And of course not. When we sin, things don't go as planned. Take a look at verse 4. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. Okay, so that part was planned. She actually does conceive. But then she saw that she had conceived, so her mistress became contemptible in her sight. Sarah did not expect that. By contempt, what is meant here is that Hagar sees Sarah as the lesser wife who doesn't have a child, and Hagar sees herself as the greater wife who has a child. And that is correct. She is the greater wife who because she has a child. But of course, it's not what Sarah has in mind. Sarah wants Hagar to give her the child so that way Sarah will be elevated, not so that Hagar will be elevated, even though Hagar is given to Abraham as a wife. Hagar's child was never supposed to be Hagar's child. It's supposed to be Sarah's child, so Sarah could be elevated. And so who does Sarah blame? She doesn't blame herself. She blames her husband. Her husband. Verse 5. And Sarah said to Abraham, may the violence done to me be upon you. I gave my servant woman into your embrace, but she saw that she had conceived, so I became contemptible in her sight. How does Abraham respond to this? Verse 6. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant woman is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your sight. Now notice how they talk about Hagar. Is Hagar a wife? No, that's not what they call her. That's not what they call her. Although Sarah gave her to Abraham as a wife, they don't talk about her as a wife. They demote her. They give her to be a wife, to take her child from her, and now when there are problems, they don't recognize her as a wife anymore. She's returned to her original status. She's demoted to the same servant woman she was originally. This is how Abraham and Sarah treat Hagar. It's amazing to me. Abram says to Sarah, do what is good in your sight. Sarah has an opportunity to actually do good towards Sarah. But that's not what she does she? What does it say? So Sarai afflicted her. Sarai afflicted her. Now, this is an interesting choice of words, because the only other time this word is used, to afflict, occurs just in the previous passage. So I want to show you where that occurs. That occurs in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. So let me give you the context. So far, Abram has defeated the kings of Kedar-Laomer. He returns Lot, saves Lot from slavery, and then Yahweh appears to him a second time after he refuses to take all the possessions from the king of Sodom. And Abraham asks Yahweh how he is to possess the land. And in Genesis chapter 15, he learns that it will not be he that possesses it, but it would be his descendants in the fourth generation that possesses it, but not after they have been enslaved for 400 years. Let me read to you Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. Then God said to Abram, know for certain that your seed will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. They will be enslaved and afflicted for 400 years. So God tells Abraham that his seed would be sojourners in a foreign land. They would be enslaved and they would be inflicted. Now, you and I think that what he's talking about is Israel, and you are correct. But in redemptive history, the first person to appear who is in a foreign land, who is a slave, and who becomes afflicted is Hagar. She is an Egyptian woman in the land of Canaan, not her home. She is a slave to Abraham and Sarah, and she is afflicted by Sarah. You see, when God said this in Genesis chapter 15, it was not clear why. Why are Abraham's descendants going to be enslaved? Why are they going to be afflicted? Why are they going to be sojourners in a foreign land? Because Abraham and Sarah do it to Hagar. They mistreat her. They enslave her. But this also gives us a clue to who Hagar really is in this story. She is the first of Israel. She is going to be an example for them of how they are to behave when they are enslaved, when they are sojourning, and when they are afflicted. Do you know how many sons Ishmael ends up having? Oh, he has 12, just like Isaac. Hagar is a picture, an example to Israel here in history of what they are to do in their slavery, of the kind of faith they are supposed to have, and the kind of faith we are supposed to have. In Hagar's affliction, she can't bear it anymore, so she flees. Verse 6, so Sarai afflicted her, and she fled from her presence. But somebody finds her. Verse 7, now the angel of Yahweh found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Verse 8, he said, Hagar, Sarai's servant woman, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress, Sarai. And the angel of Yahweh said to her, return to your mistress and humble yourself under her hands. Moreover, the angel of Yahweh said to her, I will greatly multiply your seed so that they will be too many to be counted. Consider what Yahweh is asking Hagar to do. Hagar cannot take the affliction, and so she escapes from her slavery. She escapes to the wilderness, just like Israel escapes to the wilderness. And there in the wilderness, who finds her? Yahweh finds her. And finds her by a spring, in the same way that Yahweh finds Israel by water. He asks her, where are you going? Where are you coming from? And she responds truthfully, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. But she doesn't know where she's going. She doesn't know where she's going. She's wandering just like Israel. What does God ask her to do? To return to her mistress and humble yourself under her hand. This is amazing. This is amazing what God is asking. God is asking her to return to the person, to return to the relationship in which you experienced affliction. How many of us would do such a thing? Today, people leave jobs all the time just because the hours are not flexible. I have a hard time keeping staff. But not only does Yahweh ask her to return to her source of affliction, Yahweh asks her to humble herself. What is he asking? He's asking her to return as the slave that she once was. This is seen in the way that he calls her. He calls her Sarai's servant woman. But there's good news in sight. And that is found in verse 10, because although Hagar is going to return to her affliction, to return as a slave, she will not have to give up her child. The child will be hers. For returning and for humbling herself, the child will be hers, and the child will be multiplied. Verse 10. The angel Yahweh said to her, I will greatly multiply your seed so that they will be too many to be counted. Now that should sound familiar to you too. Because a very similar thing is said to Abraham, is it not? And that is in Genesis chapter 13, verse 16. And I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your seed can also be numbered. But in fact, there is another verse that is much more like the one that is said to Hagar, but it doesn't come before it is said to Hagar. Comes to Abraham after it was already said to Hagar. That means that the promise that is given to Hagar in this form was first given to Hagar before it was given to Abraham. What does that mean? This is meant to convey that Hagar is like Abraham because she receives a promise like that of Abraham. She is the first woman in the Bible and the only woman in the Bible to have ever received such a promise. Only one. And like Abraham, who believed what Yahweh says to him and what is promised to him, Hagar believes what Yahweh says to her. And so what does she do? She doesn't even question what Yahweh says to her. Not once. Not once does she say, what do you mean return to my mistress Sarai? She mistreated me. She took me as a slave. She used my body for a child. What do you mean humble myself? She made me a wife, and you tell me I have to return to being a servant? What do you mean promise to multiply me? You've never given Abraham a child in the last 10 years. But she believed, and she returns. What remarkable faith. This is remarkable. Amazing, enormous faith. She returns to Sarah. She humbles herself for another 13 years until Sarah eventually drives her out of the family. Remember? It was Hagar that remained and Sarah that wanted her out. Notice what Hagar learns in this ordeal. In verse 13. And she called the name of Yahweh, he spoke to her. You are a God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? You know, there's one thing that I skipped over when we went through Genesis chapter 16 earlier. And the thing that I skipped over was the sight. The sight that was involved in the passage. Remember that it was Hagar who sees that she is conceived. And it is Sarah who does what is good in her sight. And now at the end of the passage, Hagar learns an important lesson. It is not me that sees. It is not Sarah that sees. It's God that sees. And who does he see? He sees me. He sees me. This is a reminder to us that when we or in relationships where we are afflicted, where we are suffering, we ought to remember that God really does see us. He really does. Even when it doesn't feel like anybody else sees you. Maybe it doesn't feel like your family notices you, understands your pain, what you go through. Maybe your husband just doesn't get it. Maybe your wife doesn't understand you. Maybe your mom and your dad don't get who you are. And maybe everybody in the situation is wrong, just like everybody in this situation was wrong. Hagar uses her sight to find content. Sarah uses her sight to afflict. Abraham fails to see at all. He wants Sarah to use her sight. But God sees Hagar, and he sees you, and he sees me. Hagar will become a picture and an example of the kind of faith that Israel is supposed to have when they are enslaved, when they are mistreated, when they escape to the wilderness, when they find no water. Yahweh would appear to them like he would appear to Hagar, and he would multiply them.
It's interesting. I can see certain patterns that are matching. I think it's clear that the descendants of Ishmael are the Ishmaelites.
That's correct.
Which are a complete fork away from the
Right.
God. Right. And I think that the slavery issue is more an indication that the Lord blesses through affliction.
Mm-hmm.
Is what happens in Egypt. He says, the more they're repressed, the more they grew. I completely agree with your take on the leveling piece, that there's wickedness spewing every which way to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I just don't think that the slavery was punishment for Hagar's enslavement. Otherwise, I think that declaration, that prophecy of 400 years, would have been made to Hagar. Because they would have said to Hagar, don't worry, you're going to get there.
Right. And I will address more of that next week. So you have to come back next week. Okay. So let us pray. Well, we want to thank you for this passage of scripture that has been preserved for us. We thank you for Hagar's example, who, when she heard you, she believed you. And she returned to her affliction and she humbled herself. And she believed that she would really have a child, and a child that would be multiplied. She believed in a very similar promise that was given to Abraham. Help us today to also believe, not to believe in Ishmael, but to believe in a greater son, the son who is Jesus, in whom we will be multiplied. And we look to that this Advent season, believing in your promise, a promise that has been fulfilled, as we prayed in the Son of Promise, Jesus. Amen. Amen.
Hello, Sudha. Hello, Jay. Hello, Belinda. Hello, Tan. Hello, Suresh. Hello, Lori. God bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and give you his peace. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and then end